She was wearing the silver star necklace I gave her for her birthday. I remember because it caught the light when she turned to wave at me just before she ran for the school bus. 1 second she was there, ponytail swinging, backpack bouncing. The next it was just the quiet hum of morning traffic and the emptiness where she'd been. No scream. No sign. Just gone. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Karen Whitmore. I live just outside Portland, Oregon. Been here all my life. I taught second grade for 10 years at the elementary school 2 miles from where we lived, where I walked my daughter to her first day of kindergarten, where I used to think nothing truly bad could happen. Back then, I thought I had a simple life. I had my routine. I had Sophie. And I had a husband, Daniel, who wasn't perfect, but he was present most of the time. He worked in structural engineering, which meant job sites and deadlines and long hours. But when he was home, he tried to be a good dad. Sophie was our only child. Bright, soft-spoken, with this way of narrating her own little world like she was the star of her own story. She'd hum without realizing it. She loved peanut butter toast, purple sneakers, and drawing stars in the margins of everything. The week before she vanished, I remember feeling this weight. Nothing specific. Just a heaviness in the mornings I couldn't explain. Fog that hung lower than usual. A coffee mug that cracked in my hand. The sound of leaves sticking wet to the sidewalk. I told myself it was just the season turning. Just October. But things were shifting. Sophie had started waking up in the middle of the night more than usual, said she had dreams she couldn't remember. One morning she asked if I'd ever had the feeling someone was watching me even when I was alone. I told her no. And then I changed the subject. Looking back now, I wish I'd asked more questions. I wish I'd paid more attention to the way her voice tightened when Daniel raised his voice, or how she clutched that necklace like it was more than just a gift. That morning, October 12th, 2010, started like any other. I made scrambled eggs. She hummed the wrong notes to a choir song. Daniel had already left for a site meeting across town. It was just me and her. I tied her shoelaces. I tucked her hair behind her ears. And then she was gone. She ran ahead like she always did, and I stood at the window watching her cross the sidewalk toward the stop sign at the corner. But this time something felt off. She turned back just for a second, looked right at me, not scared, not smiling either, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. I never saw her reach the bus. I never heard her footsteps on the porch again. And when the police asked me what time I last saw her, all I could say was this. It was 7:42 a.m., and the light was just starting to break through the clouds. And my daughter was still wearing her necklace. I didn't run toward the street. I didn't scream. I just stood there at the kitchen window for a while, staring at the patch of sidewalk where she'd been. Sophie had waved at me like always. She always did that little half-turn wave, one arm slung over her backpack strap, the other swinging free. I looked down to rinse my coffee mug, and when I looked back up, she was gone. I waited for her to reappear at the edge of the neighbor's hedge where the bus usually pulled up, but it didn't come. There was no yellow bus, no line of kids, no engine hum, just wet pavement and a drifting leaf that caught the wind and tumbled across the street. It was too quiet for a weekday morning. I didn't panic right away. I checked the clock on the stove. It was just after 7:45. Maybe the bus was late. Maybe she'd doubled back to grab something from her room. I called her name down the hall. Nothing. I walked out to the porch, my slippers dragging across the wood planks. The air smelled like wet bark and cold stone. I looked both ways down the street. No bus, no Sophie. I went back inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed the school. The secretary answered, cheerful and rushed. I asked if Sophie had made it in that morning. She paused for a second, just long enough for my heart to feel it, and then asked me to hold. I remember I sat down at the kitchen table. I remember hearing my own heartbeat in my ears. When she came back on the line, she said, "No, ma'am, we haven't seen her yet this morning. Are you sure she got on the bus?" I said yes. At least I thought so. I'd seen her run toward the stop like she always did. But I hadn't seen the bus itself. I hadn't seen the doors close behind her. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. I called Daniel next. He answered on the second ring. Still at the job site, didn't catch the urgency in my voice at first. I told him I couldn't find Sophie, that she didn't make it to school, that I'd seen her walking toward the corner and then she was just gone. He told me not to jump to conclusions. He said maybe she'd gone to a friend's house or gotten on the wrong bus. But Sophie wasn't like that. She didn't wander. She didn't change her routine. She was steady even at 7. I called the police next. I don't remember exactly what I said. I know I kept repeating her name over and over. Sophie Whitmore, 7 years old, brown hair, shoulder length, wearing a purple raincoat and a silver star necklace. They told me to stay home. An officer would be dispatched immediately. The first car arrived within 15 minutes. A young patrolman and a woman in plain clothes, Detective Laura Sanchez, though I wouldn't remember her name until later. She crouched down to eye level when she spoke to me like I was the one who needed comforting. She asked questions in a calm, steady voice. When did I last see her? What was she wearing? Had she ever tried to run away before I told her no? Never. That Sophie had been humming that morning just like always. That nothing had seemed off, except maybe the way she turned back just before the corner. But I couldn't explain what was wrong about it. Within the hour, they had a full search in motion. Squad cars drove the neighborhood in slow circles. Officers knocked on doors, asked about a little girl with a star pendant. I walked the block myself barefoot, not noticing the cold. I checked the storm drains. I checked behind the hedges. I looked up into trees as if maybe she'd climbed one. By afternoon, the flyers had been printed. Her school photo, the one with the blue sweater and the slight gap between her front teeth. Missing in bold block letters. Please help. Volunteers helped us tape them to light poles, bus stops, the doors of every gas station and coffee shop in the area. Daniel came home just before dark. His face was pale, but his voice was calm. He kept telling me the odds were good. That most missing kids turn up within 24 hours. That she probably got confused, ended up at a friend's, or maybe was still riding around on a different bus line. But as the hours ticked by, that hope turned into a silence I couldn't stand. He sat in the living room, his head in his hands, while I paced the hallway with the cordless phone in my hand, calling anyone who'd ever met our daughter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, staring at the poster on her wall of the moon and stars. I picked up her stuffed bear, the one she slept with since preschool. It still smelled faintly like her strawberry shampoo. The window was closed tight. Her shoes were in their usual place. There was no sign that anything was wrong inside the house. The wrongness was all out there. Over the next few days, the search expanded. Police checked every registered vehicle that passed through our neighborhood that morning. They pulled footage from the bank's security camera on the corner, but the timestamp had a gap, just a blur of movement, and then a blank stretch where the tape had glitched. The bus driver said Sophie never got on. Said he remembered waiting an extra few seconds at the stop, thinking she might be running late, but she never came into view. I started keeping notes in a spiral notebook. Every call, every sighting, every name mentioned. I mapped the neighborhoods, highlighted alleyways, called hospitals, called shelters. I drove to the edge of town one night just to check a gas station someone had mentioned in an online thread. It turned out to be nothing. A different girl. Different coat. Not Sophie. By the end of the first week, the search dogs had been brought in. They tracked her scent as far as the end of our block and then nothing. Like she'd evaporated. That's what Detective Sanchez said. No signs of struggle, no evidence of a chase. It's like she was there, and then she wasn't. Her voice stayed measured, but I could hear something behind it. The kind of fatigue that came from telling too many parents the same thing. Daniel and I started to unravel after that. He retreated. Didn't want to talk about the details anymore. Told me I was making myself sick with the theories. But I couldn't stop. Every face in the grocery store became a potential witness. Every parked van a threat. I stopped going to work. I couldn't stand the sound of children's laughter anymore. Not when I didn't know if Sophie was crying or scared or cold. It wasn't until the third week that the tip line slowed down. The flyers started to peel from the poles. The neighborhood stopped asking. I think people wanted to believe she'd just disappeared into a better place. That something gentle had taken her. But I knew better. Sophie didn't vanish. Someone took her. Or someone watched her leave. One night I found myself staring at the crack in the sidewalk by the corner. There was a piece of glass there, just a sliver. I thought about the way her necklace used to glint in the sun, and I wondered if anyone else would have even noticed if something small had gone missing from their life. A shoe. A voice. A child. I stood in that spot for a long time. The air was still. A street lamp buzzed overhead. And I swear I felt someone watching me from the other side of the street. But when I turned, there was nothing. Just a dark window, a drawn curtain, and silence. That's when I knew the worst was just beginning. The first time someone told me to let it go, it was my own sister. We were standing in my kitchen 3 weeks after Sophie disappeared. She'd come over with a casserole, the kind of thing people do when they don't know what to say. I hadn't eaten. I'd barely spoken. She stood there in her coat, holding the dish with both hands, and said, "Karen, maybe you need to stop punishing yourself. Maybe it's time to start healing." I didn't answer. I just opened the fridge, found no space for it, and shut the door again. That was the last time she came by. After that, the silence grew between us like mold, slow and sour and stubborn. She wasn't the only one. Friends who used to call stopped. Co-workers sent cards and then moved on. Even Daniel, who still lived in the same house, then barely spoke by the second month. The distance between us widened until the only thing we had in common was the chair he sat in and the floor I paced. Detective Sanchez tried to stay in touch. She would check in every couple of weeks, just enough to remind me they hadn't forgotten. But I could hear it in her voice. The case was slipping into that drawer all the cold ones go to. She was kind about it, professional, but the urgency had drained out of her tone. "We're still pursuing leads," she'd say. "We're keeping it active." But no one was knocking on doors anymore. No one was canvassing intersections. And the only calls that came through the tip line were from people convinced they'd seen my daughter in places she couldn't possibly be. Albuquerque, Tampa, a girl on a train platform in Topeka who turned out to be 13 and 4 inches taller. One afternoon I drove to the precinct unannounced. It was late November by then. Rain, the kind that fell sideways. I stood at the front desk with my hood still up and asked to see Laura. The officer at the counter didn't recognize my name, had to check with someone in the back. When she finally came out, her coat was still draped over one arm and she looked tired. "You can't just show up like this," she said. Not unkind, just matter of fact. I asked her if they were still looking, if they'd reviewed the security footage again, if anyone had spoken to the bus driver a second time or the crossing guard who was out sick that day. She told me they had no new developments, but they hadn't closed the file, that Sophie's name was still active in the system. I asked what that meant. She didn't have an answer. I started to realize then that if anyone was going to keep the search alive, it had to be me. I went home and cleared out the linen closet to make room for boxes. I labeled one for maps, one for photos, one for tips I'd printed out from the email chain they let me monitor. There weren't many. The first page of the notebook I kept blue spiral-bound college-ruled read, Day 49. I wrote down everything: wind direction, traffic patterns, whether the neighbors had left their porch lights on. I called other parents from the school, some of whom hadn't spoken to me since the day she vanished. Most said they didn't remember anything. Some didn't pick up at all. One mother told me gently that she didn't think it was healthy for me to keep digging. I didn't call her again. By December, Daniel had moved into the guest room. He said it was the only way he could sleep, that every time he saw Sophie's bedroom door, he heard her voice. I told him that's why I slept there sometimes, that hearing it was the only way I could stand being awake. We didn't fight. We just stopped speaking altogether. On Christmas morning, we passed each other in the hallway and didn't even nod. I wrote to the local news again in January, asked them to rerun the story on Sophie's disappearance. They declined, said they didn't have the resources to revisit old cases unless there was new evidence. I asked what qualified as new. They didn't reply. I went to the library and looked up how to request case files. I filed for copies of any public reports. Most of it was redacted. The timeline, witness statements, a log of what officers did during the first 48 hours. I read it like scripture, over and over, looking for something I'd missed. Some nights I'd drive to the corner where she disappeared and park with the engine off. I'd sit there with the window cracked, just listening. There was a man who walked his dog most nights around 10. A woman who left her porch light on until well after midnight. I knew the rhythm of every set of headlights that passed. Knew which cars turned, which ones kept going. I memorized the sounds, wet tires, distant barking, the way a neighbor's wind chimes hit a certain note when the wind came from the west. I memorized it all, hoping one night something would feel out of place. The only person who didn't treat me like I was unraveling was a man named Curtis Webb, who worked security at a business complex 2 streets over. He said he remembered seeing a little girl walking alone the morning Sophie vanished, but when I pressed for details, he admitted he wasn't sure what day it had been. He agreed to walk the block with me anyway. We retraced his steps. He pointed to the intersection, the angle of the sun, said she had a bounce in her step, but it could have been any girl, or any morning. Still, I wrote it down. The worst part wasn't that no one believed me. It was that no one wanted to believe me. That Sophie could still be alive. That she could have been taken and not found. People needed closure even if it meant assuming the worst. They wanted it boxed and labeled and finished. But I never had that. I had an open door. A silence. A question that grew louder with time. Around the 1-year mark, I stopped getting invited to neighborhood events. A woman at the grocery store asked if I'd heard about a missing teenager from Salem. I said yes, and she gave me a look like I should have been over it by now, like I was hoarding sympathy. I walked out without paying for my groceries and sat in the car for an hour. I called Daniel that night, he was living across town by then, and asked if he'd consider reopening the press campaign. Maybe an interview, a new photo. He told me he couldn't keep living in the past, that he needed to protect what was left of his life. He had a girlfriend by then. I think she worked in accounting. The night after that call, I found an envelope in the mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a printout of Sophie's missing poster folded twice. Nothing written on it. Just a faint smudge in the upper right corner like someone had touched it with ink on their hand. I held it under the light for a long time, trying to decide if it was a threat or something else. I brought it to the police station the next morning. Laura wasn't there. Another detective took it, glanced at it once and said it could have come from anywhere. That sometimes people mailed those out as part of awareness campaigns. I asked him if he noticed there was no mailing label. He said he'd look into it. I never heard back. That was the first time I felt watched. Not just alone, not just dismissed, but seen by someone I didn't know for reasons I couldn't name. And whether it meant hope or danger I couldn't tell. I only knew this if someone was still out there thinking about Sophie. It meant the story wasn't over. Not yet. And I wasn't the only one still listening. For a long time I thought if I just stayed still enough, quiet enough, the answer would come to me. Like maybe there was something obvious, I'd missed some detail I'd overlooked that would fall into place if I kept replaying it all in my head. I'd sit at the kitchen table after the sun went down, lights off except for the one over the sink, the same old pages spread in front of me. Maps, witness reports, my own scribbled timelines. The pen would sit in my hand for hours without moving. The house would creak, the fridge would hum, and I'd still be sitting there waiting for something to knock loose. I stopped calling the police unless I had something specific to say. Even Laura's patience had a limit. She'd answer, but I could hear it in her voice she was boxed in by the same dead ends I was. And after a while, it felt easier not to speak at all. People ask what grief feels like. For me, it was silence. Not just around me, but inside. A kind of flatness that settled behind the eyes and didn't go away. I started going to the same coffee shop every morning, not for the coffee, but for the rhythm of it. Same faces, same music, same smell of burnt espresso grounds and rain-damp jackets. Sometimes I'd bring Sophie's photo with me, the school one, the one we used for the flyers. I'd slide it under a clear sheet in my notebook so it wouldn't wrinkle. One morning, the barista asked if it was my daughter. I said yes. She nodded and said, "She has kind eyes." Then she turned and kept working. That meant more to me than most things people had said in a long time. By the time the second year passed, I noticed I was being treated differently, not cruelly, just quietly excluded. People started looking past me in lines. I'd walk into the post office and the clerk would switch to the other window. I wasn't angry. I understood. I was a reminder of something they didn't want to think about. Missing children don't fit into tidy conversations. They don't fade the way people think they should. And when you're the one left behind, keeping the search alive starts to look like you're refusing to heal. But I wasn't refusing. I just hadn't found a place to set it down yet. Daniel and I finalized the divorce the summer after Sophie would have turned 10. It was quiet. No lawyers in a courtroom, just paperwork and signatures. He didn't fight me on the house. Said it never felt like home to him after she was gone. I stayed. Not because I couldn't go somewhere else, but because leaving felt like admitting she'd never walk through the door again. Her room stayed the same. Pale yellow walls, bookshelf with her name painted on it in purple stuffed animals, arranged just how she'd left them. Dust collected, but I didn't clean it. It felt wrong to disturb it. That fall, I started volunteering at the library. 2 afternoons a week, shelving books, checking in donations, helping with the kids' reading circle when I could handle it. I kept to the back, mostly. I liked the order of the place, the way things had a place, and stayed there until someone came looking for them. One day, a girl about Sophie's age picked up a copy of The Starkeeper. It was one of Sophie's favorites. She used to trace the little stars on each page with her finger. I watched this girl do the same thing and felt something sharp rise in my throat. I had to step outside for air. That was the only time I had to leave early. I kept seeing her, or pieces of her, in other people. A teenager at the grocery store who turned her head just right. A young woman waiting for the bus who had the same gait. It would hit like a jolt every time. I'd find myself staring sometimes, even following for half a block, trying to make sense of the shape of their face or the way their hands moved. Then I'd realize what I was doing and stop ashamed. But the worst were the dreams. The ones where Sophie came home like nothing had happened. Where she ran through the front door wearing the same purple coat asking what was for dinner. And I'd wake up, not crying, not panicked, just empty like my body didn't know how to respond anymore. One night in early January, I took down the box of flyers from the closet. The edges were curled from moisture, the tape had yellowed. I spread them out across the floor of the living room. I just wanted to see her face everywhere for a while. I found a newspaper clipping tucked between 2 stacks. An article from the Oregonian dated October 2010. The title was simple, "Local Girl Still Missing." Below it, a quote from me I didn't even remember giving. something about not giving up. I read it over and over, trying to find that version of myself again. That same week, I got a postcard in the mail. No return address, just my name written in a clean, almost formal script. The front was a photo of a mountain town, not one I recognized. The back had 3 words written in blue ink. Keep looking, Karen. No signature, no clue who it was from. I brought it to the police. They logged it, said it could be from anyone. Could be a prank. Laura looked at it a little longer than the others did, but she didn't say much. I asked her if she thought it meant something. She said she didn't know, but she didn't throw it away either. For days after that, I kept the postcard propped up on the kitchen windowsill. I stared at it while the kettle boiled, trying to remember if I knew anyone with that handwriting. A week later, I moved it to the nightstand. It didn't make me feel better. It didn't make me feel worse. But it was something. Something new in a life that had felt like standing water. Then, one evening, just before dusk, I stepped outside to bring in the mail. The porch light flickered when I turned it on. I looked up the street the way I always did. Nothing unusual. But when I opened the mailbox, there was a single folded piece of paper inside. No envelope. No address. Just a plain sheet torn from a yellow legal pad. It had 4 words on it written in pencil. She still wears it. That was all. I read it 3 times. The air around me felt thinner, like something had stepped out of the dark. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the sidewalk, the tree line, the porch across the street. Nothing. No movement. No cars passing by. The house behind me felt miles away, though I was only a few feet from the front door. I didn't go inside right away. I just stood there, the note in my hand, the porch light buzzing weakly above. I didn't know who wrote it or why. But I knew what they meant. The necklace. The silver star. The one I gave Sophie for her 7th birthday. The one she never took off. The one no one else could have known about unless they'd seen her. Not a photo. Not a memory. Her. And just like that, something changed. For the first time in years, it wasn't just me keeping the threat alive. Someone else was out there, watching, waiting. And whether they meant to help or harm, I couldn't yet say. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sophie was still out there, and someone wanted me to know it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the note beside me on the arm of the couch, the porch light still on outside. She still wears it. I must have read that line 100 times before the sun came up. I didn't touch the coffee pot that morning. I didn't turn on the radio or the television, just sat in the quiet waiting for the sound of tires on wet asphalt or the mail slot creaking open again. But nothing came. Around 10, I took the note to the police station, same as I had with the postcard. This time, Laura was there. She took one look at it, then had me follow her back to her office. She closed the door behind us, pulled the blinds halfway down, and sat across from me. "This isn't random," she said. "Somebody's watching you." She kept her voice even, but I could tell it rattled her. I asked if she thought it meant Sophie was alive. She didn't answer that directly, just leaned back in her chair and stared at the paper like it might say something else if she looked hard enough. Later that afternoon, she called me from a blocked number, said she wanted to stop by the house. She showed up just after 5, wearing a navy windbreaker, hair pulled back in a loose braid. She brought a small evidence kit and scanned the porch, the mailbox, even the edge of the lawn for anything out of place. We didn't find fingerprints, but the paper had a faint indentation near the top, like it had been torn from a larger page. She took it with her to be scanned and bagged. I asked her what she thought the odds were that it came from someone with first-hand knowledge. She didn't speculate, just told me to keep the doors locked and to call her directly if anything else showed up. The next few days passed like fog. I moved through them, but nothing felt solid. I didn't go to the library. I didn't call Daniel. I stayed home and watched the street. I tried to remember who had come to the door lately, if anyone had stood too long across the road, if a car had idled too long near the curb. I kept the blinds cracked just enough to see the sidewalk. Every sound felt sharper. The dog 2 houses down barking in the middle of the night. The rattle of recycling bins early Thursday morning. The engine of a car I didn't recognize turning around at the end of the block, slowing as it passed. On the 4th day, I was back at the coffee shop. I brought Sophie's photo again, slid it under the clear sleeve in my notebook like always. I wasn't writing, just sitting by the window watching the corner across the street. That's when I noticed a flyer taped up on the community board next to the door, something about a fundraiser in Silverton, a town about an hour south. Nothing unusual about it. Just a list of names, a date, a blurry image of a small town square with booths and balloons. But one of the names stood out. Lena Marks. I didn't know why it hit me so hard at first. I stood there staring at the name for a full minute before I placed it. Sophie had mentioned her years ago, 2nd grade, I think. A quiet girl who moved away suddenly one summer. Her name hadn't crossed my mind in over a decade. I took a photo of the flyer, then pulled out the small box I kept at the back of my hall closet. It had old-school rosters, field trip forms, classroom newsletters. I flipped through them one by one until I found Lena's name near the bottom of a class list, dated the year Sophie disappeared. Her address was crossed out in red ink. No forwarding number, just a note beside it. Moved out of district July. That was 2 months before Sophie vanished. I stared at the handwriting. I didn't recognize it. The next morning, I called Laura. She didn't answer, but she texted me an hour later asking to meet. We sat in the same booth at that rundown diner halfway between Portland and Silverton. She brought a manila envelope and a small tablet. I slid the photo of the flyer across the table. "You recognize the name I asked?" She nodded, slowly tapped her fingers against the tablet, then turned it toward me. There was a still frame from a local news broadcast, shaky cell phone footage of the Silverton fundraiser. A crowd milling through the square tents and folding tables. But it wasn't the scene that stopped my breath. It was a girl, probably mid-20s, walking between booths with a stack of flyers in her hand, smiling at someone just off camera. She had dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, and the same jawline I'd traced in photos for years. And around her neck, unmistakable even in the grainy footage, was the silver star pendant. The scratch along one of the points caught the light just for a moment. I leaned closer. "That's her," I whispered. "That's Sophie." Laura exhaled through her nose, reached into the envelope, and pulled out a printed copy of the same image. "I've been sitting on this for a few days," she said. "Waiting to be sure." She tapped the corner of the image. "There's a man in the background. Here, standing near the food truck." Same guy shows up in 2 other clips from the event, always near her, never interacting. She pulled another print from the envelope. He's wearing a Navy baseball cap. I didn't say anything. My chest felt tight. I recognized that hat. I'd seen it before, not just in the images but in person weeks ago. At the bookstore near the square. A man leaning against a wall, half-shadowed. Watching, not browsing, just standing there. Laura flipped to another page. "We think he's a private contractor. Name's Grant Keller. Worked security gigs in the past. No formal record, but he lived in Portland around the time Sophie disappeared. 2 streets over from you." I stared at her. "So he's been around this whole time?" She nodded. "And get this, he moved to Silverton a year after Sophie went missing." I sat back trying to line everything up in my head. The name, the pendant, the man, the flyer, and Lena. Laura lowered her voice. "That's not all. We ran Lena Marks through the system. She has no tax records, no school records past age 8. It's like her family dropped off the map. The address listed on the fundraiser paperwork is tied to a private property just outside town. It's registered to someone named Margaret Marks. I knew that name too. Lena's mother. She used to run the art table at school events. Always quiet. Always watching. That night I couldn't sit still. I went back to the footage, froze it at the moment Sophie laughed, turning toward the camera. It was her. Older, yes, but unmistakable. And she didn't look afraid. She didn't look like she was in hiding. She looked like someone who had built a life and didn't expect to be found. I played the clip again. This time I focused on the man in the baseball cap. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the crowd, watching the camera. And in that moment I understood something that hadn't occurred to me before. Maybe he wasn't following her. Maybe he was protecting her. Or maybe he was making sure I didn't get too close too soon. At 1:12 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A photo, no message, just an image taken from across the street, my house porch light on curtains drawn and my own silhouette visible through the living room window. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel fear exactly. Not yet. What I felt was pressure. Something shifting, the way the air changes before a storm. I didn't know what the next day would bring, but I knew this wasn't a memory anymore. It was movement. It was now. And whoever had left that note, they weren't done. Neither was I. The next morning I drove to Silverton by myself. Laura had told me to wait, but waiting wasn't something I could do anymore, not after the note, not after the photograph of me standing in my own window. The weather had turned soft drizzle slipping down the windshield, the kind that made the trees along the road look heavier than they were. I stayed under the speed limit not out of caution, but because the stillness of the drive gave me time to think. I kept seeing Sophie's face frozen in that frame from the fundraiser footage. Older, yes, but still her. Her shoulders squared differently, her voice deeper, I imagined, but the necklace was the same. That pendant I gave her when she turned 7. I don't know if people understand how specific grief memory is. I remember the scratch on that silver star better than I remember what day of the week she vanished. It's the kind of detail you hold on to when everything else becomes blurry. Silverton was quiet by the time I arrived. Late afternoon. The sidewalks were damp, salt-streaked leftover from a freeze earlier in the week. I parked near the square where the fundraiser had taken place and walked the loop slowly, eyes trailing over every doorway, every shop window. I didn't expect to find her just standing there. I wasn't sure what I expected. But the stillness of the place made me feel like I'd arrived too late to something important. I found the coffee shop from the video and stepped inside. Warm light, the sharp hiss of steam from the espresso machine, and a bulletin board cluttered with local flyers. Piano lessons, missing cat, a printout of the fundraiser announcement still tacked in the corner. I stepped closer and scanned the names again. Lena Marks. I stared at it until someone behind the counter asked if I needed anything. I ordered a tea and took it to the window seat, watching the sidewalk like it might offer something up. 20 minutes passed before I saw her. A young woman in a dark green jacket, head down, walking fast past the bakery across the street. Her hair was tied back. I stood without thinking, nearly knocked the tea off the table, and stepped outside. But by the time I crossed the street, she was gone. I turned the corner, scanned the storefronts. Nothing. No green jacket, no sign. I waited another few minutes, letting the cold seep into my sleeves, then noticed something across the street. A man leaning against the brick wall near the bookstore, his posture too still, navy baseball cap pulled low. I recognized him before I let myself believe it. The same man from the footage, from my notes, from that moment outside my house. He didn't look at me, just stood there with his arms crossed watching the street. But when I crossed over to where he'd been, he was already gone. I stepped into the bookstore, heart pounding. The place was warm and smelled like old paper. I moved through the aisles, slowly listening. No voices, just the quiet hum of the heater and the soft groan of floorboards under my shoes. It was on the shelf to my left, face out. A copy of The Starkeeper, Sophie's favorite book. the same edition we used to read at bedtime. There was a sticker on the front not for sale display copy. I pulled it down and opened to the first page. A small star was drawn in the corner in black pen, one continuous loop, no lifting the tip. I ran my fingers over the paper and stared at that shape until the sound of the front door pulled me back. I looked up. The man was gone. The clerk at the front counter let me take the book. I said it was a personal keepsake. She didn't ask questions. I drove back to Portland with the book in the passenger seat and the photo of the fundraiser folded beside it. I didn't listen to music. I didn't call Laura. I just kept replaying what I'd seen: Sophie's laugh, the pendant, the man by the wall, the drawn star in the book. None of it proved anything. But all of it together was enough. That night I laid everything out on the dining table: the photo, the book, the notes from the fundraiser flyer. It felt like assembling a puzzle when you're not sure if all the pieces are from the same box. Around midnight I turned off the lights in the front room and stood at the window. The street was empty. The porch light across from mine flickered, then went dark. I was about to turn away when my phone buzzed. A new text. No name, just a photo. It was my street again. Same angle as before. But this time the photo was taken from farther back across the intersection. It wasn't just my house in frame. It was me standing in the front window looking out. I stared at it for a long time. I locked the doors again, even though I'd done it twice already. I turned off the porch light, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark, phone still in my hand. This wasn't just someone watching Sophie anymore. They were watching me. 2 days later, I met Laura at the diner again. She didn't waste time. Set her phone down on the table and pulled up a video. Someone sent this to the department last night. No message, just a timestamp and this clip. It was shaky footage zoomed in from across the street. Sophie, standing outside a small grocery store. Older, hair longer, posture different, but it was her. Laughing at something someone said off camera. Then a second figure stepped into frame. Lena. They stood together for a moment, then turned to load bags into the trunk of a car. Sophie looked comfortable, relaxed, not like someone being held against her will. Laura paused the frame. "Look at the bumper sticker," she said. I leaned in. The words were faded, peeling at the corners. Silverton Animal Rescue. By that afternoon, we'd pulled the records. The property was on the edge of town, registered to Margaret Marks, Lena's mother, a small rural address surrounded by trees marked as a non-profit. Quiet, unlisted. Laura wasn't ready to make a move. She said we needed more, that showing up without cause could jeopardize everything, that if Sophie was there willingly, we had to understand why. But I couldn't sit still. That night I got in the car and drove back out on my own. I didn't tell Laura. The road narrowed as it moved toward the edge of the county line. Gravel gave way to dirt. Tall trees leaned in over the windshield like they were closing off the sky. I parked before the bend and walked the rest of the way, staying low by the tree line. The house came into view slowly. A wide porch, dim yellow lights in 2 of the windows. I crouched behind a split-rail fence and watched. A dog barked from somewhere in the back, but no one came out. Then the kitchen light flickered on. A figure stepped into view. I couldn't breathe for a second. It was her. She reached for a kettle on the stove, moved around the kitchen like it was hers. There was no tension in her shoulders, no glancing over her shoulder. Just ease, just routine. A second figure joined her. Lena. They exchanged a few words, then laughed. Sophie's smile wasn't forced. It was real, and around her neck I saw it. The silver star, still there, still hers. Before I could move, headlights swept across the front of the house. A truck pulled up slowly and stopped. The driver's door opened and the man in the navy cap stepped out. He carried a grocery bag, glanced toward the trees, and walked inside. I stayed crouched for another 5 minutes listening. Then I turned and walked back to the car, gravel soft under my boots. I didn't speak the whole ride home. I didn't turn on the radio or check my phone. I just kept hearing Sophie's voice in my head, though I hadn't actually heard it yet. Just that moment in the kitchen, just her smile. I didn't know what it meant. If she was safe, if she'd been hidden, or if she'd chosen to disappear. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't chasing shadows anymore. I had seen her. She was alive. She was somewhere real. And she wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat at the kitchen table with the curtains drawn and the book still open in front of me. I kept flipping through the pages even though I knew exactly where the star was drawn. It wasn't the mark itself I was studying anymore. It was what it meant that I couldn't quite put into words, that she'd touched that page, that she'd been here somewhere and wanted to leave something behind without being found. I kept going back to that moment at the house, watching her through the window standing beside the stove like it was any ordinary night, like she belonged there. I didn't know if I felt relieved or lost. It's strange how those two things can sit in your chest at the same time. By morning, I still hadn't told Laura. I knew I should have. It wasn't about defying her or even going behind the department's back. I just wasn't ready to share it yet. The moment felt too close, too easy to unravel if I spoke it aloud. But something had shifted. I didn't feel like I was searching anymore. I felt like I was waiting, and I didn't know what for. 2 days passed before the next text came through. This time it wasn't a photo, just a message. She chose this. No name, no context, just those 3 words. I stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was meant to comfort me or push me back. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. I just saved the number, labeled it Unknown 1, and left it buried in my phone. That night I drove through the city aimlessly, ended up near one of the old parks we used to visit when Sophie was little. There was a walking trail behind the tennis courts that led to a small overlook. I sat there for over an hour waiting to see if memory would fill in any blanks. But it didn't. The truth was, I'd always believed she was taken, that someone had watched us, learned our patterns, and made their move. The idea that she might have left on purpose had never felt real until I saw her face in that window. The next morning, Laura called. Her voice was sharp, clipped. "I need you to come in. Right now." I drove straight to the station. She met me in the hallway outside her office with a look that told me the conversation wasn't going to be easy. She didn't waste time. "We got a call from an attorney, a woman named Ellen Rayner. She's representing Sophie." I think I just stared at her. Laura continued. "She says Sophie doesn't want to be contacted, that she's not missing and she doesn't want to press charges against anyone." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. Laura watched me. "Does that surprise you?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "No, not anymore." She sighed and motioned for me to sit. "I know you've been out to that property. I know you didn't tell me. I'm not going to lecture you about it. But I need you to understand something. If Sophie's over 18 and she says she left of her own will, this investigation becomes something else entirely." I nodded again. "I understand." There was a long pause. "You still believe something happened to her, though," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I think something happened before she left," I said quietly. "And I think she still carries it." Laura leaned back in her chair. "I looked into the parents. Lena's mother, Margaret, has a record of some welfare violations back in the early 2000s. Nothing major. But the way they've stayed off the radar, the way everything's tucked behind nonprofits and farm addresses, it feels deliberate." She looked down at her notes. "If Sophie's trying to start over, fine. But if someone's orchestrating that start over in a way that cuts off contact from everyone else, that's something I need to understand. We didn't come to any decisions that day. just sat in silence a while longer. Laura said she'd reach out to the attorney, try to set up a meeting even if it wasn't official. I told her I'd wait, and I meant it even if it didn't feel like the truth. A week passed. Nothing came. No text, no photos, no news from Laura. I tried to go back to work to find a rhythm again, but everything I touched felt temporary. I kept my phone on me at all times. Kept waking up around 2 in the morning, half expecting headlights to sweep across the front windows again. It was just after 1 o'clock on a Thursday when I saw her. I was walking back to my car after a meeting downtown, cutting through the covered walkway near Pioneer Square. She was standing at the far end, alone, hands tucked in the sleeves of her coat. Her hair was pulled back. No makeup, no necklace. But it was her. She didn't move when I spotted her. Didn't smile. Just looked at me like she'd been waiting. I slowed as I approached. My throat tightened. She spoke first. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was lower than I remembered, steadier. But there was something fragile in the way she stood, like she was bracing for a door to slam. I nodded. "I wasn't trying to find you. Not today." She looked away, then back. "You don't understand what happened. You think you do, but you don't." I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. Dad made things seem normal. He was good at that. He was good at making people feel guilty for noticing what didn't line up. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't stop. By the time I was 10, I already knew which rooms were safe to cry in, and which ones would get me punished for being dramatic. I felt like the air had been pulled out of the walkway. She took a slow breath. I left because I had to. Grant didn't take me. He just didn't turn me in when I asked for help. Lena found me a place to stay. Margaret kept it quiet. She looked down, then back up at me. They didn't do anything wrong. They gave me time. And I chose not to come back. I swallowed hard. "I'm not here to take you anywhere," I said. "I just needed to know if you were okay." She smiled then. Small. Sad. "I'm okay now. But I won't be if you keep digging." There was a long pause. The wind shifted slightly through the walkway, pulling the edge of her coat. She turned to go. "There's a notebook," she said without looking back. "Left behind a panel in my old closet. If you want answers, start there. But promise me something." I waited. "Don't try to rescue me. I'm not lost." Then she was gone. I stood there a long time after she left. People passed by, a few glanced my way, but I didn't move. I just kept hearing her voice. That last line. Not lost. That night I went back to the house. My old house. The one we moved out of years ago. It had sold twice since then, but I still had the number for the most recent owner. An older woman named Denise. I told her I was researching a personal story, something tied to the house's history. She said I could stop by in the morning. I didn't sleep that night either. I just waited for the sun to rise, for the door to open, for the moment I'd press my hand against that closet wall and feel whether the space behind it held what Sophie had left, and whether I was ready to read it. Denise met me at the door in a fleece robe, her reading glasses still pushed high in her hair like she'd forgotten they were there. She looked like the kind of woman who fed stray cats and trusted her gut more than a background check. I introduced myself again, reminded her of our phone call, and she nodded like she'd already made up her mind about whether or not I belonged in her home. "Shoes off," she said, "and don't touch the baseboards. I just had them redone." She led me down the hallway, the air still carrying that faint scent of lemon polish and old plaster. The house hadn't changed much, same crown molding in the front room, same creaky spot halfway down the hallway, but it felt smaller somehow. Less like a place where memories happened, more like a space where they'd been covered over with new paint. The closet was in what used to be Sophie's room. It was a little narrower than I remembered. Denise had turned the space into an office/sewing room, and she stood off to the side while I moved the desk gently out of the way. I didn't ask her to leave. I figured if something was hidden there, it couldn't be anything worse than the truth we were already living with. I knelt down and ran my hand along the back wall of the closet. Took maybe a minute before I felt it a small square of paneling that gave slightly under pressure. I braced my thumb along the edge and pulled. The panel didn't come all the way loose, but it shifted enough to reveal a slim pocket behind it. Inside was a faded spiral notebook, the kind they sell in 3-packs at grocery stores before school starts. No markings on the front. Just that dull, dusty red cover and a slight bend in the bottom right corner like it had been handled often. Denise watched me but didn't say anything. I gave her a small nod, mouthed a quiet thank you, and she nodded back before stepping out of the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, her guest bed now, not Sophie's, and opened the notebook. The first few pages were blank. Then a line of handwriting centered like a title. This is what I couldn't say. The next line smaller. If you're reading this, it means I had to go. I didn't read it all at once. I couldn't. I took breaks between each entry, walked to the window, looked out at the yard where I used to push Sophie on the tire swing. I let the wind and the traffic and the stillness in that room help carry what was on those pages. She wrote about things I'd always suspected but never wanted to confirm. About the rules that didn't make sense, the way Dad's mood could turn with no warning. How certain nights she'd sleep in the closet just to feel safer. Not because he hurt her physically, at least not in ways she named, but because there was something about his silence, his control, that made her feel small in her own skin. She wrote about being afraid of disappointing him, of the way he used her quietness as proof of obedience. She wrote about the guilt of leaving me behind, of watching me try to be the good son, the steady one, and wondering if I ever saw through it. And then she wrote about Grant. About the day she met him at the feed store, how he offered her a ride when the bus didn't come, how he never asked her to explain herself. She said he didn't rescue her, he just didn't push her back. And that was all she'd needed. There were pages and pages of thoughts, some scattered, some clear, about what it meant to disappear, about how sometimes safety isn't found in the people who love you, but in the ones who don't ask questions. I stayed there for hours, flipping through that notebook, sometimes going back to reread certain lines, sometimes just holding it without turning the page. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because it didn't feel like my story to grieve. This was hers, her account, her terms, and I was just the one who finally listened. I called Laura that afternoon and told her what I'd found. She didn't ask for a copy, just asked me to describe the general tone of it. I told her it wasn't a confession. It wasn't even an accusation. It was more like a map drawn after the journey had ended. Laura said the attorney Ellen Rayner had agreed to a meeting, that Sophie would be present on her terms. Location private. Time undisclosed until the day before. She said it might not lead anywhere legally speaking, but that it would matter. That sometimes a conversation carries more weight than a court document ever could. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday, somewhere outside Eugene. I wasn't told the exact location until the morning of. Laura drove us out there, a small retreat center tucked behind a row of pine trees, the kind of place where no one wears shoes indoors and every hallway smells like chamomile and cedar. We were shown into a room with floor pillows and soft lighting. Sophie was already there, so was the attorney, and someone else, a woman with gray-streaked braids and an open notebook. She introduced herself as a mediator, said her job was just to keep the space steady. I didn't know what to expect, but it wasn't what happened next. Sophie stood, took 2 steps toward me, and handed me a folded piece of paper. "You don't have to read it now," she said. "Just keep it." I nodded. She sat back down. So did I. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no confessions. Just a slow, deliberate conversation about what she remembered, what she didn't, and what she never wanted to remember again. She said she didn't want to be found, not because she hated us, but because finding her meant being pulled back into a version of herself she'd worked hard to let go of. She said the people she was with now, Grant, Lena, even Margaret, weren't her captors. They were her witnesses. They saw her without needing her to prove anything. Laura asked a few careful questions. The attorney stepped in once or twice. I didn't say much, just listened. Toward the end, Sophie looked at me again. "You were the only one I worried about," she said. "You always tried to hold everything together. I didn't want you carrying this too. I told her I wasn't here to fix anything. I just needed to understand." She nodded like that made sense. And that was the end of it. No final declaration, no promise to stay in touch. Just a shared silence and the sense that something invisible had been handed back to each of us. That night I opened the folded paper. It was a sketch. Pencil on plain white paper. A field. A girl. A balloon. And in the corner a single line of text in Sophie's handwriting: I was real, even when I was gone. I sat with that drawing a long time. Not because it gave me closure, but because it reminded me that closure isn't the goal. Sometimes the point is just to know that the door you kept knocking on wasn't empty on the other side, that someone had heard you, and chose at last to answer. I still have the sketch Sophie gave me. It's framed now, tucked between two panes of glass in a wood frame I picked up at a flea market outside Salem. Nothing fancy, just something simple and honest the way it deserved to be. Sometimes I pass by it and don't stop. Other days I do. I stand there longer than I mean to, reading that quiet line again: I was real, even when I was gone. And I think about everything we built to protect a version of normal that was never really safe. Everything we buried in the name of keeping the peace. After that last meeting, there weren't any more. No follow-up calls. No letters. Laura said the attorney had filed a final statement of no intent to pursue legal action. Sophie made it clear she wasn't interested in returning to her former life or pressing charges. And I understood. What she needed was distance. Not as an escape, but as a way to breathe without asking for permission. That was her justice, the right to stay gone and still be whole. Denise and I talked once, after everything settled. She asked if I thought Sophie hated her. I told her no, but I also didn't try to soften it. I told her Sophie had needed something different, and none of us had seen it in time. Denise said she sometimes still leaves the porch light on. Out of habit, she said. Not hope. We both knew the difference. I haven't been back to the rescue property. There's no need. What happened out there isn't mine to own. Lena still runs the place with Margaret. Grant keeps his distance from what I hear. Maybe that's for the best. He gave Sophie a way out. Whatever his reasons, whatever his past, she trusted him. And that counts for something. The hardest part hasn't been the silence. It's been learning to live without trying to fill it. There's no real end to stories like this. No perfect reckoning. No last scene where the camera pulls away and everything fades to peace. What there is, if you're lucky, is a kind of quiet steadiness. A place in yourself that no longer flinches when the past brushes up against the present. Sometimes people ask why I kept going. Why I didn't just accept that Sophie was gone. I don't have a clean answer. Maybe I wasn't looking for her exactly. Maybe I was just trying to find the part of our family that still made sense. And in a way, I did. I found proof that she'd survived, that she'd chosen something different, and that even when she was alone, she wasn't invisible. If you've been listening this long, thank you. These stories aren't easy to tell, and they're never neat. But if they help you remember someone or feel seen in your own silence, then maybe that's enough. Maybe all we're really doing is making sure no name, no voice, no quiet fight for freedom gets lost. If this stayed with you, feel free to share it. Someone out there might need to hear that it's okay to walk away and still be real.